You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Because history is not just about the past. History is about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a better future. So people, let's do this.
Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane for March 16th, 2016. We are coming to you this week from the Vinegar Hill Studios, located somewhere outside of Boston, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter, where my handle is @InThePastLane. Guiding us along, as always, is our wonderful executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Well, since St. Patrick's Day is commemorated this week, that's on March 17th for those of you who live under a rock, and since one of my main fields of interest as a historian is Irish American history, this week's episode of In the Past Lane will be decidedly green. We will start with a feature story that might surprise some of you, a look at the late 19th century, when Americans associated Irish immigrants with terrorism. That's right. Long before 9/11, Americans have seen various immigrant groups, including the Irish, as tied to terrorism. Did you know Irish Americans invaded Canada in 1866? Or that they funded bombings and assassinations in Great Britain in the 1880s? Or built a submarine in New York City to sink British ships? Stay tuned for the details, people. Next, we shift from terrorism to espionage. How many of you have ever heard of Hercules Mulligan? If you've seen the smash Broadway musical Hamilton, or downloaded the soundtrack, you have some idea who he was. But I think it's safe to say that Hercules Mulligan is largely unknown to most Americans, even though this Irish immigrant was an extremely important spy for the Patriot cause during the American Revolution. Trust me, you're going to want to hear more about this guy. In our third segment, it's time to bring in the Past Lane's senior historical correspondent, Stephanie Yule, for the History Skinny. That's when we talk about the ways history has made headlines in recent days. And as always, we'll talk about stories that inspire, and yes, stories that just make historians want to give up and sell hot dogs. Finally, we'll close out this episode of In the Past Lane with a look at some long-lost American slang expressions that relate to the Irish. Quick, how many of you know what Irish confetti is? Or an Irish spoon? Stay tuned for these answers and more. Okay, people, no need to fire up the GPS. We'll just follow that green stripe in the middle of the road. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. In case you haven't noticed, there's a lot of talk about immigration and terrorism these days. Specifically, many Americans are worried about the alleged threat posed by Muslim immigrants and refugees. They fear that some of these people may be motivated by Islamic extremism to commit acts of terrorism on U.S. soil, much like we saw in the recent mass shooting in San Bernardino, California. Most Americans see this problem as a relatively new one that emerged in the wake of the terror attacks on September 11th. But the association of immigrant groups with terrorism has a long history in this country. In the late 19th century, for example, many Americans feared German immigrants because a small percentage of them were avowed radicals. These fears exploded in the wake of the Haymarket bombing in Chicago in May of 1886, an act of violence that killed 7 policemen and was blamed, albeit on sketchy evidence, on German anarchists. A few decades later, Americans shifted their fears from Germans to Italian immigrants, because a small percentage of Italians likewise subscribed to anarchism and other radicalisms like socialism. A number of murders and bombings in the early 20th century were attributed to Italian immigrant anarchists, including a massive bomb explosion on Wall Street in 1920 that killed 30 people. But with this Thursday being St. Patrick's Day and all that, let's look at the connection between Irish immigration and terrorism in the late 19th century. That's right, the immigrant group that most Americans today associate with leprechauns, JFK, Riverdance, partying and parading, was in the late 19th century associated with terrorism. Now, we need to point out that there are significant differences between San Bernardino-style terrorism that's aimed at killing American citizens on U.S. soil and the terrorism that the Irish engaged in the late 19th century. The latter was aimed at soldiers, policemen, and politicians in Ireland and Great Britain for the purposes of achieving Irish independence. These differences will become apparent the deeper we dive into this story. But I want to make clear, we're not drawing a parallel here between ISIS and Irish radicals in the late 19th century. There is a similarity, and that is in how Americans perceived these Irish radicals. They saw them as threats to the safety and security of the United States. Okay, before we go any further, let's start with a quick Irish History 101. Our story today begins in the mid-1860s. So what was the situation in Ireland at that time? Well, for hundreds of years up to that point, Ireland had been ruled by England, and this colonial rule had become particularly onerous by the mid-17th century. That's when the seizing of land from the Irish and transferring it to English landlords began in earnest, along with the suppression of the Catholic Church. Periodically, the Irish rose up against British rule, most notably in 1798 and 1848. But these insurrections were all crushed. Then in the mid-1840s, the Great Famine struck Ireland, killing more than 1 million people, about 1/8 of the population, and forcing another million or more to flee, most of them to America. Among these many immigrants were ardent Irish nationalists, many of whom had participated in the recent 1848 uprising. They were determined to launch another uprising that would gain Ireland's independence, and they would take advantage of the freedoms in America to plot, to recruit, and to fundraise for this effort. In the mid-1850s, these Irish nationalists, along with their brethren in Ireland, founded a nationalist organization that came to be known as the Fenians. For simplicity's sake, we will use the term Fenian throughout this story, but it should be noted that Fenian was a broad term. It was used to describe Irish nationalists who belonged to several different organizations, like the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood. The name Fenian comes from ancient Irish mythology. It's an adaptation of the Fianna, the name of a legendary band of Irish warriors. By 1860, these Fenians had recruited thousands of members from among the Irish immigrant masses in America, and they'd raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund an uprising in Ireland to gain Irish independence. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Fenians came to see it as hugely beneficial to their efforts. That's because nearly 200,000 Irish and Irish-American men joined the Union Army. Fenian leaders reasoned that when the war was over, these battle-hardened Irishmen would make an ideal military force to help gain Ireland's independence. In 1866, a year after the war concluded, the Fenians were ready to strike, but they had come to see that sending a force of 30,000 Irish-American Fenians across the Atlantic Ocean to Ireland, that just wasn't practical. So they opted for what appeared to be the next best thing: invade British North America, or what we know today as Canada. The goal was to trigger a war between the United States and Great Britain. And this was actually something pretty easy to imagine, since Americans were still furious with Great Britain for its support of the Confederacy during the war. As soon as this war broke out between America and Great Britain, Irish nationalists in Ireland would launch their uprising. Great Britain, they believed, would be so consumed with waging war with the United States that it would be powerless to stop the Fenians from establishing an independent Ireland. Now, if you think this sounds crazy, I need to point out that many Fenians also thought it was crazy. But they couldn't stop a more militant faction within the movement from actually attempting this invasion of Canada. In the spring of 1866, precisely 150 years ago, thousands of Fenian soldiers, many of them veterans of the Union Army, gathered in encampments all along the Canadian-U.S. border, from Vermont to upstate New York. That was an impressive start, but poor organization, poor communication, and sketchy logistics resulted in only one significant invasion effort. On June 1st, 1866, a force of 1,000 Fenian soldiers, led by Civil War veteran Lieutenant John O'Neill, crossed Lake Erie aboard a flotilla of small boats, and they landed on the Canadian side. The next day, after encountering no resistance, they attacked the small town of Ridgeway, which was defended by about 850 poorly trained militiamen. The Irish invaders won the ensuing battle that saw 8 Fenians and 12 Canadians killed. At this point, O'Neill called for 3,000 more soldiers that were massed in Buffalo, New York, to cross over and join them in Canada. But by then, the U.S. military had moved in to stop the invasion. Frustrated, O'Neill had no choice but to retreat back to the U.S. So after a brief skirmish with the Canadian militia, his men boarded boats and headed back to the U.S. side. But they were intercepted and arrested by American officials. Now, let's just stop here for a moment to consider what I've just described. A group of Irish Americans, some of them still on active duty in the U.S. Army, had conspired to invade a neighboring country for the purposes of triggering a war between the United States and Great Britain. They killed 12 Canadians in the process, and had they succeeded in starting that war, thousands would have died. And who knows what the result of that war would have been for the United States. I want you to imagine a modern equivalent. What if 1,000 Pakistani Americans, all of them Muslim, gathered secretly in the desert in Arizona, formed a heavily armed force, and then invaded Mexico? And, after killing 12 Mexican soldiers, they retreated back to the United States, whereupon they were arrested. Can you imagine the reaction in this country? The fear, the rage, the talk of internment camps, or worse? Well, while you're thinking this imagined parallel over, let's return to our story. What happened to those arrested Irishmen? What became of the Fenian invaders? Incredibly, all were released, and all charges dropped. And this occurred basically for two reasons. First, American politicians did not want to alienate the Irish-American vote by prosecuting men that many Irish Americans frankly saw as heroes. And second, this was a deeply embarrassing event for the United States, and many officials just simply wanted to make it go away. By the way, we should note that this Fenian invasion did not simply go away in the minds of the people living in the various colonies that made up British North America. Rather, it helped convince them of the need to unite into a single political entity to protect themselves from the United States. This Confederation, as it was known, became official 1 year later, in 1867. So the Fenians failed to liberate Ireland from British rule, but they did help put Canada on the road to independence. Talk about the law of unintended consequences. Okay, let's get back to the Fenians. Not surprisingly, the Fenian movement fell into disarray in the aftermath of the invasion fiasco. But various factions and other Irish nationalist organizations in the U.S. continued to raise money for future operations aimed at gaining Irish independence. And some of these operations were explicitly terrorist in nature, bombings and assassinations. In the 1870s, one Fenian living in New York named Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa established what he euphemistically called a skirmishing fund. Each week in a newspaper he edited, O'Donovan Rossa reported the success of his efforts to raise money for this skirmishing fund to fund operations against the British. Other Irishmen also raised money for similar purposes. Then, beginning in 1881, Fenians in the United States and Ireland began to put this money to use. From 1881 to 1885, a dozen Fenian bombings rocked Great Britain. In 1882, radical Irish nationalists assassinated the top 2 British officials in Ireland, stabbing them to death in Dublin's Phoenix Park. At the same time, Irish nationalists in New York City hatched another truly outlandish plot. They commissioned the building of a submarine that would be used to sink British ships. Now keep in mind, while there had been many attempts, including a recent one by the Confederate Navy, no navy in the world had managed to construct a successful military submarine. But these diehard Irish Americans, they were undaunted. And amazingly, they succeeded. Well, sort of. The Fenians hired an Irish-born, self-taught marine engineer named John Holland to build the submarine. He'd been studying submarine design and tinkering with scale models for years. Now he had the funding to actually build one. The craft, dubbed the Fenian Ram, was completed in the spring of 1881. It was cigar-shaped, 31 feet long and 6 feet wide, with room for 2 or 3 crewmen. Torpedoes intended for British ships would be shot by compressed air through a tube at the bow of the vessel. Holland piloted the submarine on a number of successful test runs in New York Harbor. But by July of 1881, the secret submarine plot was uncovered by the New York Times. And in the end, the Fenian Ram was never put into action. But interestingly, John Holland, well, he went on to build the first submarines for the United States Navy. In fact, he's often referred to as the father of the American submarine fleet. That's a pretty amazing turn of events for a man linked, originally, to a Fenian terrorist plot. And if you want to see the Fenian Ram, it still exists. It's on display at the Patterson Museum in Patterson, New Jersey. Well, the bombings, assassinations, the submarine plot, along with the invasions of Canada, and I mean that in the plural because yes, there were more invasions of Canada than that one we talked about, these brought a lot of harsh criticism on the Irish in the United States. They added to the stereotype of the Irish as an inherently violent people. And you can see vivid examples of this stereotype in some of the political cartoons that I've posted at our website, inthepastlane.com. And that's at the page dedicated to this particular episode. These cartoons depict the Irish as terroristic bombers. Participation in the Fenian movement also perpetuated the claim that the Irish would never make good Americans, because their actions showed them to be disloyal to the United States and obsessed with Ireland. At least that's what their critics said. So, what became of this Fenian movement and the association of the Irish with terrorism? Well, to begin with, it's important to point out that not all Irish immigrants and Irish Americans supported Fenian violence. A great majority of the Irish in America did support efforts to gain Ireland's independence from Great Britain, but not necessarily by means of violence. And the Catholic Church in America promoted this position. The Church denounced Fenians and threatened Catholics with excommunication if they joined the movement. And so, as more and more Irish Americans began to experience upward economic mobility in the late 19th century, they tended to avoid any association with Fenian-style Irish nationalism. These Irish Americans wanted a free Ireland, but they also wanted respect. They wanted to be seen as intelligent, hardworking, sober, and patriotic Americans. As a consequence, they worked very hard to eradicate the association of the Irish with crime, with poverty, disease, drunkenness, and yes, nationalist violence. They supported efforts to liberate Ireland, but only peaceful and constitutional efforts. This was known as the Home Rule movement. They rejected violence and terrorism as misguided and harmful to the Irish reputation. And so by 1900, the image of the Fenian bomber and assassin had faded in the United States. By then, Americans were fixated on more recently arrived immigrant radicals from Southern and Eastern Europe. Over the coming decades, continued rising economic status, as well as military service and staunch support for the Cold War, earned Irish Americans a reputation as some of the nation's most loyal, law-abiding, and patriotic citizens. And that remained the case even in the late 1960s and 1970s, when Northern Ireland plunged into sectarian violence that often involved bombings and assassinations funded in part by Irish Americans. These days, no one seems to remember a time not that long ago, when Americans looked at a St. Patrick's Day parade and saw Irish terrorists. We should keep this in mind as we listen to the vitriolic rhetoric about immigration and terrorism during this election year. And you might keep it in mind if you choose to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. As always, the past has so much to teach us, but we have to be willing to listen. Don't go anywhere, people. We'll be right back. In the Past Lane is brought to you by St. Patrick's Day, celebrated in America for nearly 300 years. St. Patrick's Day wants to remind you that during this special week, nothing honors the life and legacy of Ireland's patron saint more than those special drinks in bars like the Irish Car Bomb, or green shot glasses for sale at CVS and Walgreens, or masses of drunk people trying to sing Danny Boy. St. Patrick's Day, because stereotypes can be so much fun. Who was Hercules Mulligan? Well, he's certainly a guy with one of the great names in U.S. history. Hercules Mulligan. You just can't make a name like that up. Hercules Mulligan is also featured prominently in the Broadway sensation Hamilton the Musical. But far more importantly, Hercules Mulligan was one of the greatest spies in American history. So in honor of St. Patrick's Day, let's learn a little bit more about this fascinating Irishman. Hercules Mulligan was born in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, in 1740. 6 years later, he emigrated with his family to America and settled in New York City. Mulligan's father was a wealthy merchant, so Hercules enjoyed a comfortable upbringing and received a good education. By the mid-1760s, Hercules himself was a prosperous businessman, operating a successful shop that sold cloth and made custom-tailored suits. By the mid-1760s, Hercules Mulligan had also joined the Sons of Liberty. This early patriot group had formed in 1765 to resist a series of new taxes imposed by the British, especially the Stamp Act. You know, the whole fight over no taxation without representation. 1765 was just the beginning of a decade of turmoil over taxes and heavy-handed British policies, and Hercules Mulligan remained an active member in the Sons of Liberty. In 1773, the same year of the Boston Tea Party, Hercules met a 16-year-old orphan from the British West Indies who had just arrived in New York City, and he offered to rent him a room while he studied at King's College. King's College later, of course, becomes Columbia College. His name? Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton lived with Mulligan, and when Hamilton wasn't studying for his exams and writing papers, he listened to Hercules Mulligan and his friends talk about British abuses and the need for the colonists to resist. Hamilton, not surprisingly, soon joined the Sons of Liberty. And in 1775, Hamilton penned a widely read article highly critical of Great Britain's increasingly harsh treatment of the colonies. 2 months later, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. 16 months after that, a huge British force invaded New York in August of 1776. In the ensuing Battle of Long Island, George Washington and the Continental Army barely escaped New York, and from that point on, to the war's end, New York City remained under British occupation, and it became a key center of military planning for the British. As the war progressed, George Washington recognized the importance of establishing an intelligence network in New York to get information on British military planning. So, over the next year, he put in place a network of spies that came to be known as the Culper Ring. That's Culper, C-U-L-P-E-R. One key member of this ring was Hercules Mulligan. He was probably recommended to Washington by Alexander Hamilton, who was now an officer in Washington's army. Now we should point out that spying was incredibly dangerous work. In September of 1776, the British caught a man named Nathan Hale spying in the New York area, and they hanged him in Manhattan, not far from Hercules Mulligan's home. So Mulligan and the other Culper Ring spies had to be very, very careful as they went about their work. Fortunately for Mulligan, he was in the perfect position. His tailoring business had become very popular among wealthy New Yorkers before the war, and now during the military occupation, it proved equally popular among British officers. In those days, tailoring shops were kind of like barber shops. Customers dropped in, chatted a lot, and chatted among themselves, traded gossip and so forth, while they waited for work to be done. So Hercules Mulligan, in this situation, just quietly went about his business, all the while pretending to be a loyalist. But whenever he obtained important information, say regarding troop movements or certain military plans, he passed it on to George Washington. In one crucial instance, Mulligan heard of a British plot to capture George Washington. He passed on the information, allowing George Washington to change his plans and foil the plot. Needless to say, had George Washington been captured, the Patriot cause would have been all but doomed. Well, Mulligan played his role of tailor/spy perfectly for the whole war. But as the war came to an end, he had a big problem. Mulligan had performed so convincingly as a loyalist that most New Yorkers were convinced he was a loyalist. And this was not a good position to be in the early 1780s. Loyalists were being driven from the colonies by angry patriots. Some were tarred and feathered, and a few were killed. Fortunately for Mulligan, George Washington came to his aid. On November 26, 1783, George Washington triumphantly processed into New York City as the last ships full of British troops departed. As he reached Lower Manhattan, he stopped at the home of none other than Hercules Mulligan. The two enjoyed a breakfast together, after which Washington publicly praised Mulligan as, quote, a true friend of liberty. No one threatened Hercules Mulligan again after that. Mulligan went on to enjoy a long and prosperous life in the years that followed. He died in 1825 at the age of 85. And then he faded into historical obscurity, but not permanently. In 2004, Ron Chernow published a best-selling biography of Alexander Hamilton, and in it, he related the role Mulligan played in Hamilton's early life and his role as a spy in the Revolutionary War. And this is the book that Lin-Manuel Miranda read that inspired him to create Hamilton the Musical, which, if you haven't heard, it's about the hottest thing to hit Broadway in many, many years. So there you have it. The incredible story of the great Irish spy who helped win the American Revolution. Who knew? Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. It's time for the History Skinny, a segment in the show where we examine how history has made headlines this week. Joining me now is In the Past Lane's senior historical correspondent, historian Stephanie Ewell. Hello, Stephanie. Thanks for dropping by to In the Past Lane to talk a little history in the news.
Well, you know, it is the favorite part of my month. Thank you.
Well, great to have you here.
So, as is often the case, history has made a lot of headlines this week, big and small. So what stories of the many stood out to you as especially noteworthy?
Well, there are a few, but I think since we're in the wake of the Oscar season, I think it would be fun to start with the proposed film by a guy named Zack Snyder. He is
Quite
known.
well known, yes.
Yep. He's the guy who puts out that DC universe of comic book superhero films. People are really anxiously awaiting the Batman versus Superman film that he's putting out.
Yeah, who knew they weren't friends?
Who knew they weren't friends? I thought they were all on the same side, but there's a dark side to that world. But he is proposing or thinking about, allegedly, putting together a film about our founding father, George Washington, but in the style of 300.
Yeah, so we know that George Washington certainly was a very important military commander, a very adept and successful one.
Absolutely.
And we do believe that it's important that people learn about history and historical figures.
Right, but the question is in whose hands, right?
And in what dimension, what will this be a one-dimensional superhero?
Exactly.
George Washington.
Well, and the thing is that what gives me pause right from the start is that Snyder was inspired in part, allegedly, by the Emanuel Leutze 1851 Washington crossing the Delaware painting.
Right.
Iconic painting, really, let's talk about vigorous masculinity painting. But we know that there's a lot of problems with that painting, right? I mean, there are the nitpicky historical facts of those are the wrong boats. If George Washington had his foot on the side of the boat, they would have all fallen in the Delaware River.
Become the frozen father.
Exactly. There were no horses brought over on the boats. They would have brought over on ferries. I mean, there's those little kinds of things
and,
that generally...
the wrong flag.
And the wrong flag. Absolutely the wrong flag. So those are the kinds of things that where historians are really annoying at cocktail parties. I know more than you know. It's not right. But there's a bigger thing here that I think is interesting, which is that painting by Leutze did a lot of work intellectually and in the imagination around the idea of a manifest destiny. You know, it's a really forward-looking, small p progressive Whiggish view of this crossing of the Delaware. And it's, developed at a time when the U.S. settlers are pushing west and colonizing and settling the West, that manifest destiny piece.
And Leutze is painting images of manifest destiny, actual ones of settlers, the course of empire.
Wagons
and so
going
forth.
across, exactly.
So it fits well into that idea.
It does. And so you have this Hollywood producer or director, I'm not sure which he is, using an iconic but largely mythic and highly politicized image of a really important revolutionary battle, and then wanting to put a patina on it. That's this sort of video game, super slick, almost Baz Luhrmann, what he did with Gatsby, image on top of this story. And I guess on the one hand, part of me says, great, more history in the public sphere. This is good. Somebody will finally know a little bit about George Washington. But I do worry a little bit about, is there a danger to that? What kind of story are we going to tell? Is it going to be a story that, particularly in these times, is it a little dangerous to talk about the crossing of the Delaware as this sort of destined by God, manifest destiny, imperialist move? And when we think about what's going on in the world today, when we think about our current presidential primaries, and we think about
the emphasis on the Republican side, this relentless emphasis on rebuilding the military and so forth, seems to be a top issue.
Exactly. So I think that it would really appeal to those forces in the culture. It would probably be a slick production. I'm sure it would be a lot of fun, but I think there will be a lot of playing fast and loose with history. And so I'm not sure it's our best instincts to put that out there in this particular kind of packaging.
I think so. And I think also we know that Washington was very physically courageous. So there's a lot to like about him as a sort of a manly man in the field.
Yeah.
But
he's nice and tall.
Very tall. But one of the things that made him a great general was that he was very deliberative and very democratic when he talked to he polled his officers on the nights before battles. He wasn't this kind of just relentless forward-charging badass. He was a real consensus builder. And many historians, including David Hackett Fisher, have said this is what made him, one of the things that made him a great general, was that he took the opinions of his officers into serious
Which is really the opposite of our current political discourse, right? And of course, then there's the other piece of it, which is we've already talked about in the past lane, is the question about Washington as an enslaver of human beings, right? So on the one hand, how much are you going to make this a heroic tale of him? For example, will Zack Snyder deal with Lord Dunsmore's proclamation? Is he going to deal with that question, the question of enslavement and revolution and liberation? So I think there's a lot of possible places for him to step in some big holes and fall into the abyss of poor entertainment that doesn't edify.
At which point he can take the get out of jail free card, which is, I'm not a historian.
I'm not a historian, so it's not a big deal. Right. But it reminds me of Michael Wallace's wonderful phrase, edutainment, and the dangers of edutainment when he's talking about Disney in particular. When are we trying to educate and when are we trying to entertain? And can those two things really go hand in hand? Given the nature of history and the difficult and complex issues you've got to deal with, violence and power and oppression and all sorts of things. So
how much it's good that young people know about Pocahontas, but not necessarily the Pocahontas
Disney.
Presented by Disney.
But
it's going to be very interesting because that was just a speculative sort of rumor mill
Yeah.
thing. But usually those things do, especially a person like Snyder's,
he can
stature,
get the funding,
that
right?
It can happen. So we'll have to keep an eye on
and
that
it'll
one.
appeal. But it makes me thinking about Zack Snyder, thinking about George Washington, thinking then about this question around slavery and this question of edutainment. It also brings up some of the other headlines of the week, which have talked about this flurry, to quote a headline, of new slave-related projects in movies and in television. So I thought that it might be interesting to talk about that. In particular, one of the favorites of my childhood, which was Roots.
Mm-hmm.
Alex Haley's Roots. I mean, that was, I don't know if you watched it, but Kunta Kinte,
mind-blowing.
Aunt Kizzy, I mean, the whole gang. And
also, what makes it interesting when you look at the data on how many people watch that, it's really hard for students today to, back in the days of 3 networks, to say, I don't know what the numbers were, but it's a incredible
massive
percentage
slice
of
the American
population,
population, right?
show.
And the Holocaust that then came after it, right? So I love the fact that LeVar Burton of the Reading Rainbow is now going to be an executive producer of it, and they've got a lineup that's an incredible.
Lawrence Fishburne and many.
Forrest Whitaker. I mean, it's some really, really great actors. But I'm curious to see how they're going to, if it's going to be a pure remake, and if in fact any of the storyline, which was so much a 1970s storyline, so much a product of the kind of quasi post civil rights era, if it's going to reflect at all Black Lives Matter movement and our current cultural zeitgeist around questions of race and power and violence in America.
It will be interesting, and it will be interesting to see if the fact that it's airing on the History Channel, which has not necessarily been a place of cutting-edge provocative history of any sort in the last 10 years.
And you can tell from some of the glossy photographs that they're putting out that, first of all, everyone's beautiful. They're all beautifully dressed.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to see, or at least maybe that's what I was thinking about, also the WGN America's Underground series.
Right, so that debuted back on March 9th,
Mm-hmm.
and it certainly has generated a lot of attention, and I haven't had a chance to see it.
I haven't either.
I look forward to it. There's just too much good TV
There is too much good TV. But there's also this Birth of a Nation piece, which I find really interesting as a person who's very interested in D.W. Griffith's original film, and how it's going to be the story.
So this is Nate Parker.
Nate Parker,
a very well-known African-American actor and director.
Right. Who is then taking the story of Nat Turner's slave revolt in 1831 and playing on the language of Birth of a Nation, which was D.W. Griffith's the nation after the Civil War is being reborn under the banner of white supremacy, right? And I'm really interested to see how he's going to critique that. So I'm actually much more excited about the Birth of a Nation, kind of like the Hamilton twist, than I am about Zack Snyder doing George Washington. I think this has the potential to really, really push boundaries. But I did want to read a quote from him where he talks about Nat Turner as a man whose fight was against injustice. It's not just a film for Black people. It's a film about freedom for all of us. It promotes healing. I think that's really interesting, but at the same time, Nat Turner was interested in killing white enslavers, So this is that interesting line around how much can something be a unifying force, a disunifying force? Can we get to the place where we are able to confront our past and make it a healing process and not feel implicated by it in the present in ways that encourage division?
Right, and shut off conversation.
That's the real challenge, I think, of a film like that. I can't wait to see it.
I can't wait to see it as well, and I wonder if it's going to... It seems to me 12 Years a Slave, which came out a couple years before, was more of that healing, or more of that confront the reality of the past kind of a movie, where you couldn't walk out of that film without saying, wow, I've been either educated or I've been greatly reminded about the brutality of slavery.
Right, but the difference there is
lose sight of that. Yeah.
Exactly, but the difference there is Solomon Northup never picked up a weapon and tried to kill white people and get other Black people to do the same. I mean, Nat Turner is a revolutionist. And it reminds me of something actually that happened in the past couple of years down in Charleston, South Carolina, where Denmark Vesey also had planned a slave revolt. It was a failed revolt.
But a decade earlier?
And he planned this slave revolt, and he was a man who had bought his freedom. He'd won the lottery and bought his own freedom, and became a preacher, and preached to the local Black population in Charleston that we're going to take up arms, and this is the only way to get justice. The only way to get justice is through violence, because there's no justice in this system. Kind of echoes of future
movements,
future Black separatist movements. And it's interesting because there was a lot of talk for a lot of years in Charleston about how do we memorialize or not memorialize, and the question of, is he a freedom fighter? Was Denmark Vesey a terrorist? And of course, the slave revolt never happened. He was found out, snitched on, and hanged along with his compatriots. But a couple of years ago, the city of Charleston did put a statue up of Denmark Vesey in Hampton Park, which is up near the Citadel in Charleston. And it was a very controversial thing.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. Now, nobody knows what Denmark Vesey actually looked like, right? And then there was a question.
It's
an imagined and it's very, very heroic. But there was a lot of concerns too that it's not in the historic district. So to go see this, you've got to go uptown,
Yeah, and the historic district, tell us a little bit more about that. That's South Carolina.
Well, Charleston's the first historic district in the country. It is a place that banks on historical tourism. Very much
the Gone with the Wind.
Very much the Gone with the Wind, the Moonlight Magnolia, even colonial heritage, a place of gentility and
parasols and mint juleps.
All that good stuff, right? And so the city itself has really made some great strides in recent years on trying to have a more inclusive, more complicated public history landscape. And so the Denmark Vesey statue is one of those. Recently, I think it was just last May, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, the two daughters of enslavers that then became rabid abolitionists and women's rights advocates and actually left South Carolina because there was a price on their head. Recently, the city of Charleston put a plaque up on their home. So that's always been a kind of a silenced history.
Yeah, because it didn't fit the more Gone with the Wind.
It didn't fit it, right. And then and then back in 2007, one of the biggest things that happened in Charleston was the opening of the Old Slave Mart Museum, which was in the site of what had been Ryan's Mart, which was a actual auction house that, among other things, was most known for chattel slavery, selling the commerce of human beings.
Right, which was very significant in Charleston. Right?
Absolutely,
it was not a small sideline thing. And it was something, didn't the popular historical narrative say, slavery...
We didn't really sell, we didn't sell slaves here, we being white folks, right? We didn't sell slaves here. This was just about selling the family furniture and the family silver. But also this idea that we don't focus very much in this country on the domestic slave trade. There are people like Walter Johnson or Michael Tadman who've done that work. But for the most part, we default to the international slave trade. And I argue that that's because we can then think of slave trading as an inheritance of colonialism, like an unfortunate collateral.
And we're stuck with it.
And we're stuck with it. As opposed to the domestic slave trade with moving cotton and sugar down to the old Southwest, right? That required just millions of bodies and labor. That's something
these forced marches.
These coffles, right? And that's something that Americans did. That's not an inheritance. That's something that we, white Americans, created and maintained and profited from. So the Slave Mart Museum is a really interesting space because it's an actual site of the sale of human beings.
And it's right in the middle
of the historic district. It's right on Chalmers Street. It's a half block from what they call the Four Corners, really trying to act as a radical intervention into that landscape. I think it's really interesting how the commercial aspect of the slave trade is getting more and more traction. I mean, even just this week down in Charleston on the old Exchange Building, which had been the site of many domestic ships coming down the coast and dropping off human chattel and then selling them right there on the streets of Charleston, right at the Exchange Building. Just this week, last week, I guess it was, they put a marker dedicating that site. And that's a big deal.
Yep.
But it's different when it's a building and a plaque versus actual human beings either performing in person or on stage or on screen. So it'll be interesting to see how those various slavery films and TV projects play out.
Yeah, and also what's
the blowback
what's next in places like Charleston and Richmond and elsewhere in terms of presenting a deeper, more complex, more three-dimensional, as opposed to a one-dimensional plaque, a three-dimensional depiction of what the involvement in slavery really was.
Because the problem is you can blow by it, right? And the thing with even the Slave Mart Museum, which gets 25,000 visitors a year, it's still less than the plantations. It's a tiny little space in the historic district, but it's small. And in some ways you're preaching to the choir. So
the people that would seek it out are the people that are a little bit more inclined.
Are already critiquing the narrative, already saying this is unidimensional. So that's where these television and film projects are fantastic because they may expand the audience. The question is, what's that edutainment going to look like?
Yeah, how valuable is it, and are they missing an opportunity to do a lot more?
Exactly. But then again, as historians, we also have to let go a little and say, well, even if it's poorly done, it'll open a conversation, you hope, and not reinforce certain kinds of stereotypes. I don't think this will, though. I think he's going to do a great job with Birth of a Nation in particular. It's going to be pretty searing.
It's got a lot of people looking forward to it for lots of good reasons. So.
Right. So I think that's great. I think it's an exciting moment. Less excited about George Washington as Batman.
Right.
I am George. Right? Isn't that how Batman talks?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Find my wooden teeth. I am very excited about the birth of a nation and Underground Railroad and some of those things. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Sounds great. Well, thank you once again for dropping by here in the Past Lane.
Absolute pleasure, as always.
And since this is St. Patrick's Week, and some of our features this week are about Irish this and Irish that.
Yes.
And I know you are partly of Irish extraction.
I am an O'Rourke, yes.
Right. So happy St. Patrick's Day to you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for the History Skinny. In the Past Lane's senior historical correspondent, Stephanie Yule, is a historian and professor of history at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Mass. You can learn more about Stephanie and all her many publications and projects at our website, inthepastlane.com. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
In our final segment today, I want to take a look at some American slang terms that use the word Irish. I came across this when I was looking up a term I'd learned in graduate school, and I was studying Irish American history. And that term is Irish confetti. And I was told that Irish confetti referred to paving stones, basically granite blocks that were used to pave city streets, but they were called Irish confetti because during riots, which often involved Irish immigrants, people would dig up these stones and throw them at each other or throw them at the police. So it's a very snarky kind of term that describes rioting and describes the Irish, makes it clear that the Irish are often at the center of rioting. So when I went and looked up that term in a book called the Random House Historical Dictionary of American Slang, I not only found Irish confetti, I found 46 more entries that began with the word Irish. And 38 of the definitions began with the notation, now usually considered offensive. So that'll give you an idea of the nature of these things. They basically all showed the Irish as being poor, ignorant, unrefined, and violent. So let's take a look at a couple of them. How about an Irish apple? That is a potato. An Irish baby buggy? That's a wheelbarrow, which is also sometimes known as an Irish ambulance and an Irish chariot. How about an Irish clubhouse? That's an easy one. Police station. An Irish dividend? An Irish dividend is a non-existent profit. An Irish nightingale? A bullfrog. An Irish promotion? An Irish promotion is actually a demotion. An Irish Pullman? That's a railroad handcar. You know, the kind with the hand crank. An Irish spoon? An Irish spoon is a shovel. And what about an Irishman's coat of arms? That would be 2 black eyes and a bloody nose. Well, we can laugh at some of these because honestly they are quite clever and some of them are kind of funny. But we should also remember that they indicate just how hard things were for the Irish way back in the 1800s. And they also indicate how far the Irish have come since then. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Well, people, as always, this has been a lot of fun. But I'm afraid we are out of time. I want to thank you for listening, and I encourage you to weigh in with comments, questions, and suggestions via social media and at our website, inthepastlane.com. At this site, you'll also find links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to all the things we've talked about in this episode. And you can learn more about our guests, correspondents, and other contributors. And speaking of social media, In the Past Lane is an independently produced podcast, so we rely on loyal listeners like you to help spread the word. So if you like this podcast, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And please, oh please, take a moment to write a review at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access this podcast. Reviews are incredibly important for pulling in new listeners. So please, take 60 seconds to leave one. Thanks. In the Past Lane has been made possible by the hard work and dedication of many people. They include technical advisors Holly Hunt and Jesse Anderson, photographer John Buckingham, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, and our intrepid executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for our podcast, and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next week for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey Lulu, you excited about St. Patrick's Day?
So excited.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.